Hello everyone, welcome to our Ethnicity and Crime PowerPoint. I'm going to run through the PowerPoint, go through across all of the key content in preparation for the Sociology AQA Paper 3 Crime and Deviance paper. Okay, so criminal stats show that people from ethnic minority backgrounds, particularly black people, are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested and imprisoned. So here's a quote from the Ministry of Justice that addresses that issue. Members of our black communities are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched, 3.5 times more likely to be arrested, and 5 times more likely to be in prison. So that is a quote from the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom. So it's probably a good idea if you're one of our students to make some notes and write down some of those statistics, because you'll be able to use them as supporting evidence in some of your answers, depending on what questions come up. Sociologists then, as sociologists, what we have to do is ask a couple of questions about this data. First one, are ethnic minorities more likely to offend? And if so, how do we explain such differences? Or are the criminal stats misleading? Is the criminal justice system racist and does it discriminate against ethnic minorities? And hopefully this PowerPoint will set out to answer that question and provide more clarity on the issue of crime and ethnicity in the United Kingdom. Okay, as we know as sociologists, statistics can be misleading. So how are we to gain a clear picture of the link between crime and different ethnic groups? In addition to statistics on the ethnicity of those involved with the criminal justice system, we can use 2 other sources of statistical data to shed more light on the issues of ethnicity and offending. The first are called victim surveys. If you remember this, we have looked at this previously for crime and deviance, and victim surveys ask individuals to say what crimes they have been victims of. So this is an anonymous survey that is sent out to people, and they fill it in and talk about their victimhood. We have self-report studies, which ask individuals to disclose their dishonest and violent behaviour. So for our students at our college, we have looked at self-report studies recently. So you can go back to one of your previous booklets and lessons to learn a little bit more about that. So victim surveys ask individuals to say what crimes they've been victims of. We can gain lots of information about ethnicity and offending from such surveys when they ask victims to identify the ethnicity of a person who committed the crime against them. Victim surveys show that large proportions of crime is what is called intra-ethnic. It takes place within rather than between ethnic groups. For example, most white criminals target white victims. And if you want quite an extreme example, if you look at crime statistics when it comes to serial killers and the type of victims they choose, the vast majority of serial killers almost always kill within their own ethnicity. So that's an example of intra-ethnic crime. So whilst helpful in identifying ethnic patterns of offending, there are several limitations to victim surveys. Okay, number 1, they rely on victims' memory of events. So for our students who are sitting AQA, and this information may feed into a 30-mark answer, these are like the evaluative points that you can bring to bear on the question. So they rely on victims' memory of events. According to Phillips and Bowling, evidence suggests that white victims may overly identify black people, saying the offender was black even when they are not sure. Victim surveys only cover personal crime, which make up only 1/5 of all crime. So, for example, they don't talk about corporate crime, green crime, state crime, etc. They exclude under 10s. Minority ethnic groups contain higher proportions of young people. And they exclude crimes by and against organisations, so they tell us nothing about the ethnicity of white-collar and corporate criminals. And they're not representative, as they only tell us about ethnicity of a small percentage of offenders. So victim surveys do provide some insight and can be used to determine patterns of criminality and victimisation across ethnic groups, but the points on the board now should be used as evaluation to show that they are not perfect and they are full of flaws. Self-report survey. Okay, so Graham and Bowling from 95 found that 43%, black and white people have very similar rates of offending. If you look at black people 43%, white people 44%, it's effectively the same. Indian people 30%, Pakistani people 28%, and Bangladeshi people have a much lower rate of offending. And Shard and Budd notes that in the 2003 Offending Crime and Justice Survey of 12,000 people found that white people white people and those of mixed ethnicity are more likely to admit to having committed criminal offences. So what does this data tell us about the reliability and validity of self-report surveys? Self-report surveys do not support the evidence provided by official stats and victim surveys that ethnic minorities are more likely to be involved in crime. Limitations of the self-report study include the following. Respondents may lie on the self-report survey. This makes the data invalid. People are more likely to admit to committing less serious crimes, shoplifting, for example, than serious crimes, so the data could be skewed. The experiences of those completing the survey can never be substantiated. So we're going on trust and assuming that the person filming the survey is actually telling the truth. So there's some evaluative points for self-report survey. So one of our tasks is to outline and explain the ethnic differences that occur at each stage of the criminal justice system. Now, you won't be asked a question like this in the exam because it's too broad and too big, basically. But what we need to show an awareness of across the questions or across the entire paper are how ethnic minorities are treated, dealt with every stage of the criminal justice system. So we have to look at policing, prosecution and trial, stop and search, arrest and caution, conviction and sentencing, and the prison system. So we're just going to work our way through each one of these in relatively short amount of time and cover what we need. Okay, policing. Phillips and Bowling, 2012. Since the 1970s, there have been many allegations of oppressive policing of minority ethnic communities. Mass stop and search operations, paramilitary tactics, excessive surveillance, armed raids, police violence, and death in custody, and a failure to respond effectively to racist violence. So these are findings from Phillips and Bowling of the experiences of ethnic minorities, specifically black British people within the British police system. And if you look on the next slide, I've just got a few bits of data or data points that support that. So a lot of this information is taken from either official inquests into the death of non-white people in police custody and other government reports. So BAME deaths in police custody. So this is from an inquest into the deaths of BAME people in police custody. It says the disproportionality in the use of force against black people adds to the irrefutable evidence of structural racism embedded in policing practices. Phillips and Bowling repeat their quote as well. Okay, so let's have a look at differences in offending. Large-scale migration from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent began in the 1950s. Until the 1970s, there was a general agreement that the minority ethnic communities had a lower rate of offending than the white population. However, from the mid-1970s, increased conflict between the police and Afro-Caribbean communities in particular, and higher arrest rates from street crime meant that, quote, black criminality increasingly became to be seen as a problem. It was not until in the late 1990s that crime by people of Asian descent also began to be viewed as a problem, with media concerns about the growth of, quote, Asian gangs. So if you look at the dates and the times, what you can look at are trends in wider society. So late 1990s, early 2000s, when we talk about a rise in, quote, Asian crime, what we're talking about ostensibly is like Middle Eastern. And the idea is that after the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in the early 90s, we started to see a rise of Islamic extremism presented in the media as a threat. And obviously after 9/11 that continued. So the question is, are people from that ethnic group committing more crimes, or is the media simply focusing in on that and reporting it more, which gives the impression that more crime is coming out of a particular group than is actually true? Okay, if we move on to explaining differences in offending, it's clear that crime stats do show some difference between ethnic groups, and there are two main explanations for these stats: left realism and neo-Marxist. Left realists suggest that the statistical data is valid and there are real differences in rates of offending, but the stats are true, but there's a reason for it. Neo-Marxists suggest that the statistics are invalid and due to racist labelling and discrimination. So let's look at left realism. Left realists argue that ethnic differences in stats do reflect real differences in offending by different ethnic groups. Left realists see crime as a product of three major categories: relative deprivation, is the lack of resources needed to sustain the diet, lifestyle, and activities that an individual or group is accustomed to, not having enough to survive in society. So, we're talking about deprivation a lot. So, for our students, think about class and what we talked about for working class students and working class people and why they may be more likely to commit crime. This brings in potentially strain theory. And relative means that people feel deprived and lack resources or cultural resources relative to their neighbour or other ethnic groups or class groups. So it's deprivation in relation to other groups. Marginalisation. Ethnic minorities are more likely to be marginalised, unemployed and in poverty. Left realists argue that racism has led to marginalisation and economic exclusion of minority groups. As well as this, the media's emphasis on consumerism promotes a sense of relative deprivation by setting materialistic goals that many members of ethnic groups are unable to achieve by legitimate means. So, for our students, if you think back to our study of class and strain theory and some of the reasons why working class people may become criminal, deviant, enter gangs, they look for illegitimate opportunity structures in subcultures that enable them to meet materialistic goals. Okay, that is also true of ethnic minorities because, as it says, ethnic minorities are also likely to be marginalised and found in poorer areas and victims of poverty. So they may, because of the materialistic goals of society are seen as unachievable, they may divert to illegitimate opportunity structures to achieve those. So it relates to class very heavily. Okay, so as a result of this, what may happen are delinquent subcultures. So we've already talked about this in class, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. And what you should do is revise your booklet and your lesson content from class, delinquent subcultures, marginalisation, and status frustration. Okay, so as a result, members of ethnic groups may form delinquent subcultures. This leads to an increase in utilitarian crime as a way of dealing with relative deprivation. Utilitarian crime, remember, utilitarian, it has a utility. So we're talking about theft of necessities and things people need to survive, and also things people need to alleviate their sense of deprivation. Marginalisation can lead to frustration and non-utilitarian crimes such as violence and or antisocial behaviour. So, for example, a group may feel or may be oppressed over time by the state, and when they, over decades, they try to get their voice heard through all of the legitimate avenues and institutions, police, courts, media, when a group feels that those voices are not being heard or they're being marginalised further by the state, it can lead to violence and other types of antisocial behaviour. So if you're in a case study, look at something like the riots that took place in Toxteth, Liverpool, I think in 1981. They were very much a consequence of frustration. They were non-utilitarian crimes in the sense that they were not being committed to, feed a hungry family or meet some sort of ease some sort of deprivation. It was very much a frustration against the systemic marginalisation and horrific treatment of the black community in Liverpool. So that's a good example to look at there. Okay, so subcultures, we've done this already, but I'll run through it super quick. Subcultural strain theory. Subcultural theories see deviance as the production of a delinquent subculture which has different values to mainstream society. Subcultural theories focus on working class, and in this case ethnic groups, who, it is claimed, are denied the opportunity to achieve success by legitimate, acceptable means. So in what ways are the working class denied opportunities to achieve? Reduced educational opportunities, and obviously this is increased and further felt by members of ethnic minority groups. So growing up in poverty may lead to crime as a necessity to survive. I think that's very much a class thing. That applies to anyone within that working class area, including different ethnic groups. Laws are written by the ruling class, which in Britain is ostensibly a white conservative group. Cultural deprivation, material deprivation, social mobility may be very difficult. So the goals of our society may not be achievable for these factors, and that is one of the many reasons why people may join subcultures. So Cohen talks about status frustration. He talks that the less able we are to meet society's goals, the more frustration we feel. And that frustration comes with our status in life, our class place, or either our ethnic backgrounds and where our society sort of positions different ethnic groups. So Cohen argues that working class boys face anomie in a middle class dominated education system, and that also applies for ethnic minority groups in a white middle class dominated education system and society. They may suffer from cultural deprivation and do not need the skills needed to achieve, and their ability to succeed in middle class white hegemonic world leaves them at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And as a result, people in working class environments, this example on the board talks about education, but we can apply this to ethnicity as well. Groups may feel what we call status frustration, which is frustration experienced by individuals when they are denied the opportunity of attaining social status. Okay, so if you come back to left realism, Lee and Young, 93, argue that the differences in offending rates cannot be explained by racism within the police, as the majority of crimes in the crime stats are reported to the police by the public rather than discovered by the police. Lee and Young suggest that the fact that black people have a higher rate of criminalisation than Asian people shows that this cannot be due to police racism unless the police are very selective in their racist attitudes. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And that's presented as a criticism, but I would push back and say there is evidence to suggest that the police are in fact selective in their racist attitudes. And I'm not saying the police are racist, I'm just saying the data speaks for itself. Black people are targeted more, so feel free to push back against Lee and Young at that point. Okay, but critics of this argue that the differences in arrest rates between black people and Asian people are due to different ways the respective groups are perceived by the police. For example, seeing black people as dangerous, Asian people as deceptive, etc. So we're talking about like historical racial stereotypes and how they are held by people within these institutions, and how they maybe then affect their perception of other groups and how they then may enact upon that in the real world. Okay, so let's move on to neo-Marxism. Paul Gilroy. Paul Gilroy is a key sociologist and key theorist across, not only sociologist, but media studies as well. Absolutely fascinating person. Okay, so neo-Marxism. Left realists see official stats as reflecting real differences between ethnic groups. However, neo-Marxists argue these differences are an outcome of what they call social construction that stereotypes ethnic minorities as inherently more criminalistic than the majority population. So Paul Willis and Paul Gilroy both agree that ethnic groups are stereotyped by a racist police force and criminal justice system, and as a result they are more likely to appear in criminal statistics. So Gilroy has a background in what we call post-colonial theory, and he's very interested in the decline of the British Empire, but the after effect of that. And he talks about, like, broadly across his theory, how the British psyche, if you like, and British national identity has never really covered or evolved or moved on from its post-empire colony days. So as a result, the British mindset is still rooted in that imperialist mindset. So what we do is we still hold on to the worldview, like stereotypes about different ethnic groups and cultures from back then, and it's still very much something that is used to sort of, if you like, it's found across all parts of our society. So Gilroy says ethnic minority crime can be seen as a form of political resistance against a racist society, and the resistance has its roots in earlier struggles against the British Empire and imperialism. So Gilroy argues that most ethnic minority people in the UK come from former British colonies where their anti-imperialist struggles taught them how to resist oppression. Gilroy argues that this resistance has its roots in these earlier struggles against the British state, and what acts of resistance like protest and rioting were common tools to use against the British. When facing oppression in Britain, many people adopted the same forms of resistance, demonstration, protest, riots, which were then criminalised by the British state. So these ideas are sound, and Gilroy is obviously well researched and very knowledgeable about the topic, but there are some criticisms of the idea, so let's go through some of them. So this is how we can evaluate Gilroy's neo-Marxist perspective. New left realists Lee and Young criticise Gilroy, and they say first generation immigrants in the 50s and 60s were very law abiding, so it's unlikely that they passed down a tradition of anti-colonial struggle to their children. Most crime is inter-ethnic, so it can't be seen as an anti-colonial struggle against racism. Lee and Young argue that, like critical criminologist, Gilroy romanticises street crime as somehow revolutionary when it is nothing of the sort. Asian crime rates are similar to or lower than white people's. If Gilroy were right, then the police are only racist towards black people and not Asian people, which seems unlikely. Now, remember, everyone, these points are the points from Lee and Young, and your job is to remember them, apply them to Gilroy's work, but also critique those ideas themselves. So this, for example, this last point, if Gilroy were right, then the police are only racist towards black people and Asian people, which seems unlikely. I don't know how to say this other than, I've lived in the world for long enough to make me rethink that, no, that seems actually very likely. And it's not like opinion necessarily. That's based on the evidence that we presented at the start of the lesson and the evidence that seems to be pretty consistent across Western police forces. So it's definitely something to consider. But make sure you remember Lee and Young's point and use it to criticise or evaluate the work of Gilroy. Okay, Stuart Hall. So Stuart Hall is a sociologist. He also is a media theorist. And if you remember, Stuart Hall is the theorist who talked about or coined the term moral panics. So we have done them before, and his study we looked at previously on moral panics looks at how the police targeted young black men in a spate of muggings in the 1970s because the media reinforced that particular group with that, reinforced the links between that group and that crime. Okay, Hall says the bourgeois are able to rule and control the subordinate classes through consent. However, in times of crisis, this becomes more difficult. So, for example, during the 1970s, British capitalism faced a crisis. High inflation and rising unemployment led to strikes and industrial unrest. The troubles in Northern Ireland were intensifying. So this is, if you heard of the IRA, for example, that's tied to this. So the troubles is a fight, a struggle of resistance against British imperialism. It's the native Irish people in Northern Ireland half the people want to remain part of a united Ireland, and they use violence and revolutionary tactics against the British Empire. So the Troubles is a consequence of British imperialism in Northern Ireland. Student protests were spreading across the country. 1979 was the winter of discontent. So imagine the cost of living crisis, but more intense. That's what happened. Okay, so when opposition to the state begins to grow, the ruling class use force to maintain control. However, the use of force must be seen as legitimate, or it may provoke more resistance. So Stuart Hall combines Marxism with elements of interactionism in his study Policing the Crisis, and he argued that newspapers carried stories about muggings in the 1970s and implied that muggers were mainly young black men. This created the moral panic, which led to the government giving the police greater powers. So by concentrating on street crime, Hall argued attention had been deflected away from the real economic problems of society. Instead, members of the proletariat were being labelled and made scapegoats, and a moral panic had occurred. The media had reinforced the false consciousness. So the point being is that when there are these massive problems in society, which we've just listed, that are caused by the ruling class, like we have today with a lot of the cost of living crisis, these are caused by the ruling class. So what happens, the media, as an ideological state apparatus, they begin to focus in on maybe working class crime to take our attention away from that. And that then masks the crime of the ruling class, who is ostensibly white middle class, bourgeois, and focuses on ostensibly working class, white or ethnic minority crime. If you want an example of this in the modern 2024, in our 2024 society, a lot of the problems in our society are caused by Brexit, really poor decisions in government, and decisions made by the ruling class. However, if you look at the media, what they identify as the main problem are boats, migrants, working class people sponging off the state. So it's a way to use the ideological state apparatus of media to keep the working class in a false class consciousness. So if you see, working class people really, really strongly complaining about the boats and migration, there's an example of false class consciousness, because they are not fully aware of their own exploitation, and they are promoting ruling class ideology, and that's the point Hall is making. So Hall points out that there's no evidence of a significant increase in muggings at the time. Muggings was reinforced as a, quote, black crime by the media, police and politicians. And he argues that the emergence of mugging as a threat to society in the 1970s is a direct response to the crisis British capitalism faced. The myth of black muggers served as a scapegoat to distract attention from the true cause of problems such as unemployment, the capitalist crisis. So the black mugger became a symbol of disintegration of the social order, the feeling that the British way of life was, quote, coming apart at the seams. So obviously very, very similar to what's happening now. The moral panic also served to divide the working classes on racial grounds, to weaken opposition to capitalism, and to win more votes from right-leaning voters, so they would implement authoritarian laws to control and suppress the population. So this really could be used, this language and this theory on this slide, we could be describing 2024. It's the same playbook. It's that when the ruling class are losing control, or some of their ideology is started to impact the working class to a point that they're starting to resist it. They use ideological state apparatus such as media, etc., to create a scapegoat and blame all problems on them. And it draws attention away of the working class from the ruling class crimes. And therefore they internalise that and think crime is primarily a working class issue. So it's quite insidious. Okay, so I'll leave this on screen for a second, but if you would like to pause it for an example of what we've just talked about, please do so. This is Suella Braverman, as she talks about the channel crossings. I've got some quotes on the screen, and then on the right-hand side of the screen, I have got some of the real reasons why these issues are happening, and it's just an example of Stuart Hall's theory and what he said in the modern world. Okay, so criticisms or of critiques we can use in our evaluation of Hall. Downs and Rock argue that Hall is inconsistent in claiming that black street crime was not rising, but also it was rising because of unemployment. Hall does not show how the capitalist crisis led to a moral panic, nor does he provide evidence that the public were in fact panicking or blaming crime on black people. And left realists argue that inner city residents' fears about muggings are not panicky, but realistic. It's not a moral panic or exaggeration. The issue is a legitimate one. So there we go. So there are Stuart Hall, Policing the Crisis, and some evaluative points from a new left realist perspective. Okay, so we're going to have a quick look at some more recent approaches, and we're nearly done. Okay, so more recently, post-2000s, sociologists have offered other explanations for ethnic differences in crime rates, including the following. So the first one is neighbourhoods. Fitzgerald et al. 2003 examined the role of neighbourhood factors in explaining the crime rates. Street robbery rates are highest in very poor areas where young black people are more likely to live. However, white people in similar areas are also more likely to commit street crime. Therefore, ethnicity was not the cause. Poverty is a much more important factor. Black people may be more likely to live in poor areas because of racial discrimination in the housing and job markets. So, to come back to something we said earlier, this supports our viewpoint and our claim that a lot of the causes of crime are less to do with ethnicity and significantly more to do with class. So as we've explained in class, as most ethnic minority groups are either when they arrive in Britain placed in poorer areas or are found in poorer areas, they're more likely to suffer the same sort of crimes but also be driven to commit certain crimes or acts of deviance based on class factors such as material deprivation, etc. So if we look now at ethnicity and victimisation, so up until recently the focus on crime stats has been perpetrators of crime. However, now in modern sociology there's a more interest in the ethnicity of the victim. So racial victimisation occurs when an individual is selected as a target because of their race, ethnicity or religion. Racial victimisation is nothing new. However, it was brought into greater focus following the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. So for our students, if you download the PowerPoint off our Teams or website, there are links embedded into the PowerPoint, which I'd really encourage you to watch. So this video is about Stephen Lawrence, his murder, and what went wrong with the police investigation, and it covers a lot of the reasons why the crime happens, like racial victimization, and also some of the failings of the police, which indicates institutional racism was at play. So it's a very, very serious, very harrowing, very sad story. But we can study it to learn of some of the failings of the police force, and a lot of the failings we find reinforce the points that are made by some of our sociologists. So I strongly encourage you to watch it. Okay, this other video talks about the police force itself and how the police were complicit in effectively covering up certain bits of information that could have led to conviction. So the British police, this is really one of the most shameful things that our police force has ever done. So I'd strongly encourage you to watch it because it gives you a good idea of the struggles that black people in particular in Britain face when one of their sons is murdered. and some of these stumbling blocks and obstacles they face within the criminal justice system are pretty shocking and deplorable. So watching these videos will give you a real sense of what we're talking about. And then we also had Anthony Walker, who is from Liverpool. So if you don't know this story, Anthony Walker was a black British student who was murdered with an ice axe by Michael Barton and Barton's cousin Paul Taylor in an unprovoked, racially motivated attack on the night of 29th of July 2005. Excuse me. So whilst waiting for a bus stop with a friend, Barton and Taylor, who were 20, approached and threatened to stab Anthony Walker and his friend. So Anthony and his friends walked to the next bus stop but were followed in a car by Barton and Taylor. Anthony was murdered in McGoldrick Park in Liverpool. Barton and Taylor fled to Amsterdam but were arrested on their return to the UK on the 3rd of August. Anthony Walker was 18 years old and was a second year of his A-levels. So this is a completely unmotivated racial attack that shook Liverpool, and it's another case study which is obviously very tragic and harrowing and awful, but it's definitely worth, the Anthony case is definitely worth reading about, because again it'll give you a greater understanding of racial victimisation, and it's a case study that you can read about to enhance your understanding of this particular issue. Okay, so if you finish ethnicity and victimisation, the police recorded 54,000 racist incidents in England and Wales in 2014-15, mostly damage to property or verbal harassment. However, many such incidents do go unreported. The Crime Survey of England and Wales estimates that there were actually over 89,000 racist incidents during the same period. The risk of being a victim of any sort of crime varies by ethnic group. The British Crime Survey show that people from mixed ethnic backgrounds has a higher risk of becoming a victim of crime than black people, Asian people, or white people. The differences may be partly the result of factors other than ethnicity. For example, violent crime, factors such as being young, male, and unemployed are strongly linked with victimisation. Ethnic groups with a higher proportion of young males are therefore more likely to have higher rates of victimisation. In addition, Sampson and Phillips argue that the stats do not capture the victims' experiences. They note that racist victimisation tends to be ongoing over time, with repeated minor instances of abuse and harassment. It is likely that such instances are rarely reported and therefore do not appear in the stats. So this information can be used to evaluate ethnicity and victimisation, and obviously support the arguments that statistics are not particularly valid because of the reasons on screen. Okay, so we've run through the content for ethnicity and crime. Now, please remember that you need to revise class as well because of strain theory, status frustration, and some of the other crossover points. And make sure when you are revising this topic and thinking about writing an answer that you do consider crime as well. Okay.